Chapter 17. One kind of experience is the story. God never wrote a good play in his life. Kurt Vonnegut. Story and game duality. At the dawn of the 20th century, physicists started noticing something very strange. They noticed that electromagnetic waves and subatomic particles, which had long been thought to be fairly well understood phenomena, were interacting in unexpected ways. Years of theorizing, experimenting, and theorizing again led to a bizarre conclusion. Waves and particles were the same thing, both manifestations of a singular phenomenon. This wave-particle duality challenged the underpinnings of all that was known about matter and energy and made it clear that we didn't understand the universe quite as well as we had thought. Now, we are well into the next century, and storytellers are faced with a similar conundrum. With the advent of computer games, story, and gameplay, two age-old enterprises with very different sets of rules show a similar duality. Storytellers are now faced with a medium where they cannot be certain what path their story will take, just as the physicists found that they could no longer be certain what path their electrons would take. Both groups can now only speak in terms of probabilities. Historically, stories have been single-threaded experiences that can be enjoyed by an individual, and games have been experiences with many possible outcomes that are enjoyed by a group. The introduction of the single-player computer game challenged these paradigms. Early computer games were simply traditional games, such as the tic-tac-toe or chess, but with the computer acting as the opponent. In the mid-1970s, adventure games with storylines began to appear that let the player become the main character in the story. Thousands of experiments combining story and gameplay began to take place. Some used computers and electronics, and others used pencil and paper. Some were brilliant successes, others were dismal failures. The one thing these experiments proved was that experiences could be created that had elements of both story and gameplay. This fact seriously called into question the assumption that stories and games are governed by different sets of rules. There's still much debate about the relationship between story and gameplay. Some people are so story-oriented that they believe that adding gameplay is guaranteed to ruin a good story. Others feel the opposite, that a game with strong story elements has been cheapened somehow. Still, others prefer a middle-of-the-road approach. As game designer Bob Bates once told me, story and gameplay are like oil and vinegar. Theoretically, they don't mix, but if you put them in a bottle and shake them up real good, they're pretty good on a salad. Setting theory aside and taking a good look at the game titles that people really enjoy, there can be no doubt that stories must do something to enhance gameplay, since most games have some kind of strong story element, and it is the rare game that has no story element at all. Some stories are thick, epic tales like the elaborate multi-hour storytelling of the Final Fantasy series. Others are incredibly subtle. Consider the game of chess. It could be a completely abstract game, but it isn't. It has a gossamer-thin layer of a story about two warring medieval kingdoms. And even games with no story built in them at all tend to inspire players to make up a story to give the game context meaning. I played Liar's Dice with some school-age kids recently, and which is a completely abstract dice game, and they liked the game, but after a few rounds, one of them said, "Let's pretend we're pirates, playing for our souls," which was greeted with enthusiasm around the table. Ultimately, of course, we don't care about creating either stories or games. We care about creating experiences. Stories and games can be each thought of as machines that help create experiences. In this chapter, we will discuss how stories and games can be combined and what techniques work best for creating experiences that neither a gameless story nor a storyless game could create on its own. The myth of passive entertainment. Before we go any further, I want to deal with the persistent myth that interactive storytelling is completely different from traditional storytelling. It would have hoped that by this day and age, with story-based games taking in billions of dollars each year, this antiquated misconception would be obsolete and long forgotten. Sadly, it seems to spring up, weed-like, in the minds of each new generation of novice game designers. The argument generally goes like this. Interactive stories are fundamentally different from non-interactive stories because in non-interactive stories, you are completely passive, just sitting there as the story plods on, with or without you. At this point, the speaker usually rolls back his eyes, lolls his tongue, and drools to underline the point. In interactive stories, on the other hand, you are active and involved, continually making decisions. You are doing things, not just passively observing them. Really, interactive storytelling is a fundamentally new art form, and as a result, interactive designers have little to learn from traditional storytellers. The idea that mechanics of traditional storytelling, which are innate to the human ability to communicate, are somehow nullified by interactivity is absurd. It is a poorly told story that doesn't compel the listener to think and make decisions during the telling. When one is engaged in any kind of storyline, interactive or not, one is continually making decisions. What will happen next? What should the hero do? Where did that rabbit go? Don't open that door. The difference only comes in the participant's ability to take action. The desire to act and all the thoughts and emotions that go with that are present in both. A masterful storyteller knows how to create this desire within a listener's mind and then knows exactly how and when not to fulfill it. This skill translates well into interactive media, although it is made more difficult because the storyteller must predict, account for, respond to, and smoothly integrate the actions of the participant into the experience. In other words, while interactive storytelling is more challenging than traditional storytelling, by no means it is fundamentally different. And since story is an important part of so many game designs, game designers are well served to learn all they can about traditional storytelling techniques. The dream. But wait, I hear you cry out. I have a dream of beautiful interactive storytelling, a dream that rises above mere gameplay, a dream where a wonderfully told story is completely interactive and makes the participant feel like they are in the greatest movie ever made, while still having complete freedom of action, thought, and expression. Surely this dream can't be achieved if we continue to imitate past forms of story and gameplay. I admit that this dream is a beautiful one that has spurred the creation of many fascinating experiments in interactive storytelling. But so far, no one has come anywhere close to realizing this dream. But this hasn't stopped people from creating interactive storytelling experiences that are truly wonderful, enjoyable, and memorable, despite the fact they are somewhat limited in the structure and in the freedom they give the participant. Shortly, we'll discuss the reasons this dream hasn't become a reality and may never become a reality. But first, let's talk about what actually works. The reality. Real world method 1. The string of pearls. For all the grand dreams of interactive storytelling, there are two methods that dominate the world of game design. The first and most dominant in video games is commonly called the string of pearls, or sometimes the rivers and lakes methods. It is called this because it can be visually represented like this, and there's an arrow pointing to a circle, which then is connected to another arrow, which then points to another circle, and then so on and so forth. The idea is that a completely non-interactive story, the string, is presented in the form of a text, a slideshow, or an animated sequence, and then the player is given a period of free movement and control, the pearl, with a fixed goal in mind. When the goal is achieved, the player travels down the string via another non-interactive sequence to the next pearl, in other words, cutscene, game level, cutscene, game level. Many people criticize this method as not really being interactive, but players sure do enjoy it. And really, there should be little wonder at that. The string of pearls methods gives the player an experience where they get to enjoy a finely crafted story punctuated with periods of interactivity and challenge. The reward for succeeding at the challenge? More story and new challenges. Though some snobs will scoff, it is a neat little system that works very well, and it strikes a nice balance between gameplay and storytelling. While older games were sometimes ham-fisted with their approach, some newer games such as Ico, The Walking Dead, and The Last of Us have shown how artfully the string and the pearls can be joined together. Real-world method number 2, the story machine. To understand this method, we have to take a good look at what a story is. It is nothing more than a sequence of events that someone relates to someone else. I was out of gum, so I went to the drugstore is a story, just not a very interesting one. A good game, however, tends to generate series of events that are interesting, often so interesting that people want to tell someone else what happened. From this point of view, a good game is like a story machine, generating sequences of events that are very interesting indeed. Think of the thousands of stories created by the game of baseball or the game of golf. The designers of these games have never had these stories in mind when they designed the games, but the games produce them nonetheless. Curiously, the more prescripting the designer puts into their game, like with the string of pearls, the fewer stories their game is likely to produce. Some video games, such as The Sims or Minecraft, are specifically designed to be story generators and are very effective in this regard. Some critics Some critics say that these games don't really count as interactive stories because the stories have no author. But we don't care about that because all we care about is creating great experiences. If someone experiences something they consider a great story and it has no author, does that diminish the impact of the experience? Certainly not. In fact, it's an interesting question to consider which is more challenging, to create a great story or to create a system that generates great stories when people interact with it. Either way, this is a powerful method of interactive storytelling and one that should not be ignored or taken for granted. The vast number of Let's Play videos on YouTube and Twitch are testaments that people like to share these stories. Use this lens to determine how to make your game a better story generator. Number 73, or lens number 73, the lens of the story machine. A good game is a machine that generates stories when people play it. To make sure your story machine is as productive as possible, ask yourself these questions. When players have different choices about how to achieve goals, new and different stories can arise. How can I add more of these choices? Different conflicts lead to different stories. How can I allow more types of conflict to arise from my game? When players can personalize the characters and setting, they will care more about story outcomes, and similar stories can start to feel very different. How can I let players personalize the story? Good stories have good interest curves. Do my rules lead to stories with good interest curves? And finally, a story is only good if you can tell it. Who can your players tell the story to that will actually care? In terms of methods of interactive storytelling, these two methods surely cover 99% of all games ever created. What is interesting is how opposite they are from each other. The string of pearls requires a linear story to be created ahead of time, and the story machine thrives when as little story as possible has been created ahead of time. But surely there is something in between, I hear the dreamer cry. Neither of these methods are the real, true dream of interactive storytelling. The first method is basically a linear path, and the second one isn't really storytelling at all. It's just game design. What about my vision of a wonderfully batching story tree full of AI characters and dozens of satisfying endings so that a participant wants to enjoy it over and over? And this is a good question. Why isn't this vision a reality? Why isn't it the dominant form of interactive storytelling? The usual suspects, consider conservative publishers, a weak-minded mass audience, lazy designers, are not to blame. The reason that this vision isn't a reality is because it is riddled with many challenging problems that haven't been successfully solved yet and may never be solved. These problems are real and serious and deserve careful attention. The problems. Problem number 1. Good stories have unity. Really, it is a simple thing to make an interactive story tree. Just keep making choices that lead to more choices that lead to more choices. Do that, and you'll get all kinds of stories. But how many of them will be enjoyable? What kind of interest curve will they have? One thing that we know about good stories is that they have intense unity. The problem that is presented in the first 5 minutes of the story is a driving force that has meaning all the way until the end. Imagine an interactive Cinderella story. You are Cinderella. Your stepmother has told you to clean out the fireplace. Do you 1. Do it, or 2. Pack your bags and leave? If Cinderella leaves and, say, gets a job as an administrative assistant, it isn't the Cinderella story anymore. The reason for Cinderella's wretched situation is so that she can rise out of it dramatically, suddenly, and unexpectedly. No ending you could write for the Cinderella story can compare with the ending that it already has, because the whole thing is crafted as a unit. The beginning and ending are of a piece. To craft a story with 20 endings and one beginning, that is the perfect beginning for each of the 20, is challenging, to say the least. As a result, most interactive stories with many branching paths end up feeling kind of watery, weak, and disconnected. Problem number 2, the combinatorial explosion. I fear there are too many realities. John Steinbeck travels with Charlie. It seems so simple to propose. I'll give the player 3 choices in this scene, 3 in the next, and so on. But let's say your story is 10 choices deep. If each choice leads to a unique event and 3 new choices, you will need to write 88,573 different outcomes to the choices the player will make. And if 10 choices sound kind of short, and you want to have 20 opportunities for 3 choices from the beginning to the end of the story, that means you'll need to write 5,230,176,601 outcomes. These large numbers make any kind of meaningful branching storytelling impossible in our short lifespans. And sadly, the main way that most interactive storytellers deal with this perplexing plethora of plot lines is to start fusing outcomes together, something like figure 17.3. And this certainly makes the storytelling more manageable, but look at what has just happened. For all the choices the player had, well, not that many here really, they all end up at the same place. How meaningful can these choices have been if they all lead to the same conclusion? The combinatorial explosion is frustrating because it leads to compromises on top of band-aids, on top of compromises, and ultimately a weak story. And you still have to write a lot more scenes than the player will ever see. One thing that interactive storytellers like to fantasize about is how wonderful it is that a story can have multiple endings. After all, this means the player will be able to play again and again with a different experience every time. And like many fantasies, the reality tends to disappoint. Many games have experimented with having multiple endings to their game story. Almost universally, the player ends up thinking 2 things when they encounter their first ending in one of these. The first thing is this the real thing? Or the real ending? In other words, the happiest ending, or the ending that is most unified with the story beginning. We all like to dream that we can find a way to write equally valid endings, but because good stories have unity, this generally doesn't happen. And when players start to suspect that they may be on the wrong track, they stop experiencing the story and start thinking about what they should have done instead, which defeats any attempt at storytelling. The string of pearls has a tremendous advantage here. The player is always on the correct story path, and they know it. Any problem-solving action is surely a path toward a rewarding ending. The second thing, do I have to play this whole thing again to see another ending? In other words, the multiple endings go against the idea of unity, and as much as we would like to dream that the gameplay would be significantly different if the player made different choices, it almost never is. And so the player now has to go on a long, repetitive trudge to explore the story tree, which probably will not be worth the effort and tedium, since there is likely a lot of repeated content upon a second playing in an attempt to manage a combinatorial explosion, which will look pretty bad under lens number 4, surprise. Some games have tried novel approaches to this, with this problem. The infamous game Psychic Detective, once summed up in a review as one of the worst games ever made, also a masterpiece, was a continuously moving 30-minute experience that always culminated in a final psychic battle with the villain, in which your powers were determined by the path you took through the game. As a result, to master the game, you had to play it through over and over again. Since most of the game consists of video clips and the game tree has some significant bottlenecks that you must experience every time, the designers filmed multiple versions of the bottleneck areas, each with different dialogue but containing the same information. As hard as the designers worked to solve the problem of repeated content, and many other problems, players generally found the process of replaying the interactive story somewhat tedious. There are exceptions, of course. Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic featured a novel type of player choice. Did they want to play the game on the light side or dark side of the Force, that is, with good or evil goals? Depending on which of the paths you took, you can have different adventures, different quests, and an ultimately different ending. It can be argued that this isn't really a case of two different endings on the same story, but two completely different stories, so different that they are each equally valid. Players who try to take the middle path, the beige side of the force, generally find the experience to be dissatisfactory. Problem number 4, not enough verbs. The thing that video game characters spend their time doing are very different than the things that characters in movies and books spend their time doing. Video game verbs: run, shoot, jump, climb, throw, cast, punch, fly. Movie verbs: talk, ask, negotiate, convince, argue, shout, plead, complain. Video game characters are severely limited in their ability to do anything that requires something to happen above the neck. Most of what happens in stories is communication, and at the present time, video games just can't support that. Game designer Chris Swain has suggested that when technology advances to the point that players can have an intelligent, spoken conversation with computer-controlled game characters, it will have an effect similar to the introduction of talking pictures. Suddenly, a medium that was mostly considered an amusing novelty will quickly become the dominant form of cultural storytelling. Until then, however, the lack of usable verbs in video games significantly hampers our ability to use games as a storytelling medium. Problem number 5. Time travel makes tragedy obsolete. Of all the problems that interactive storytelling faces, this final one is quite possibly the most overlooked, the most crippling, and the most insoluble. The question is often asked, why don't video games make us cry? And this may well be the answer. Tragic stories are often considered the most serious, most important, and most moving type of story. Unfortunately, they are generally off limits to the interactive storyteller. Freedom and control are one of the most exciting parts of any interactive story, but they come at a terrible price. The storyteller must give up inevitability. In a powerful tragic story, there's a moment where you can see the horrible thing that is going to happen, and you feel yourself wishing, begging, and hoping that it won't, but you are powerless to stop this path toward inevitable destiny. This rush of being carried along toward certain doom is something that video game stories simply cannot support, for it is as if every protagonist has a time machine, and anything seriously bad that happens can always be undone. How could you make a game out of Romeo and Juliet, for example, where Shakespeare's ending, spoiler alert, they both commit suicide, is the real ending for the game? Not all good stories are tragic, of course, but any experience that met the qualifications of the dream of interactive fiction should at least have the potential for tragedy. Instead, we get what the narrator in Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time intones when your character dies. Wait, that's not what really happened. Freedom and destiny are polar opposites. As such, any solution to this problem has to be very clever indeed. The Dream Reborn. The problems with the dream of artificial... The Dream Reborn. The problems with the dream of interactive storytelling are not trivial. Perhaps one day, artificial personalities so realistic that it is impossible to tell from humans will be intimately involved in our story and gameplay experiences, but even that does not solve all of the problems presented here, any more than a well-run game of Dungeons and Dragons, where human intelligence is behind every game character, can solve all these problems. No magic solution is likely to solve all 5 at once. This is not a reason to despair. The reason the dream is a failure is because it is flawed. Flawed because it is obsessed with a story, not the experience, and experience is all we care about. Focusing on story structure at the expense of experience is the same sin as focusing too much on technology, on aesthetics, or on gameplay structure at the expense of experience. Does this mean we need to discard our dreams? No, we just need to improve them. When you change your dream to one of creating innovative, meaningful, and mind-expanding experiences, and keep in mind these may need to mix and blend traditional story and game structures in untraditional ways, the dream can come true for you every day. We live in a sea of stories, but most people new to storytelling find it harder than they expect. The following tips and Chapter 18, Indirect Control, address some interesting ways to make the story elements of your game as interesting and involving as possible.